Hi, my name's Adam Burke. Welcome to Live and Local. I was able to sit down with George Stoney. He's our guest this week on Live and Local. George is a filmmaker, documentarian. He teaches film at NYU. He's been a professor there for many years. He is known as the grandfather of public access for his role in starting that up. We're going to hear him talk a little bit about that. He's also a documentarian and filmmaker. He's sometimes called the Johnny Appleseed of documentary filmmaking. He's 88 years old, still going strong. He's still making videos, and we'll hear him talk a little bit about his life and his documentaries and his role in public access, starting that up. So let's take a listen to George Stoney.
As a kid, like almost every literate person, young person in the 30s, I wanted to be a novelist, because the novelists were the people that you read about and you followed and so forth and so on. But I soon realized that I didn't have that kind of talent. And in college, I went to Chapel Hill, and to make extra money, I would write feature stories. And I found that I was living on other people's experiences. I've been, in effect, living on other people's experiences ever since. I mean, I keep telling my students that the people you're really beholden to are the people in front of your camera. And it's your job to help them express themselves. And incidentally, your shaping of it gives you a chance to express yourself. But your main job is to help them. And the satisfaction of seeing people get a chance to speak for themselves has been, I think, in many ways much more satisfying than seeing my own work on the screen. The first decade of this century may be the golden age of documentary. Every week, I type out a list of documentaries around town on screens around Manhattan. And it's a rare week when at least 5 or 6 documentaries are not playing on screens. It's actually, you can see them in the theaters, and they run for 2 weeks and all of this. That's because the public is is going to the movies the way they'd read nonfiction books. And they know also that those things will be available in other ways. The Donnell Public Library, the New York Public Library, is a marvelous place, a storage house for this. And so if something's run on PBS, you know in 2 months you can get it out of the public library, you can look at it again. And so it's the same reason people are going for nonfiction books. You notice in the New York Times book reviews that more than half the books every week are nonfiction books. And that's representative of the book market, I think. Documentaries are coming from so many more sources than they ever were before. It used to be just a few venues were making documentaries. Now, many, many more sources are making documentaries. And you go up to a festival like the Hot Doc Festival in Toronto, and you see all these people coming in looking for documentaries that will have a larger audience. And with the DVDs and so forth, you're getting a much wider distribution. It's interesting that, and by the way, the DVD, the quality is amazing. I did a film many years ago called How the Myth Was Made, a comment on Robert Flaherty's Man of Erin, how and why Flaherty made the film he did in the 1930s and what effect it's had on the island. And that has been often used in connection with Flaherty to question the whole idea of documentary. Well, they just did a DVD of it. And in the first place, Flaherty's work looks so wonderful on that big screen because we're used to seeing all these terrible beat-up, scratched old prints, and there it is in all its glory. And my film, which the prints are faded now, but they went back and got the original, and they did some color correction. I've never had a better print of my film. And they're that right there. Well, when Home Entertainment put out the DVD, I hope that's not a commercial, put out that DVD, they said, they got my permission, of course, and they said, we'll give you a choice of a certain percent of the profits or $2,000. Well, of course, I said, I want the $2,000. I don't think you're going to sell more than a few hundred of these. I may be wrong. People are buying them by the thousand. It's amazing. So it's for the same reason that you see people looking at buying and reading nonfiction books. I think people are recognizing the fact that they have trapped themselves by lazy viewing habits. We use it as we use television as a distraction so often. We don't watch shows from beginning to end, and they want to do something about it because they want to get more than just that. And the DVDs and the videos give them a chance to do that. And they want to play it over again. You see, it's interesting that so often when I've got a tape or a DVD at home, I want to go back. But did I really understand that? Well, with a book, I always can do that. And I think eventually that the DVD is going to give us a chance to start looking at tapes in the same way that we read books, from the index back even. I mean, I'm sure I'm not the only person who seldom reads a nonfiction book starting at the introduction and going through. I usually go to the index and then go back, and then I may read the other. And I think eventually that we'll put DVDs together to do that. And by the way, it's also going to be a godsend for those of us who work on projects and then see so much of the stuff that we wanted to put in the tapes destroyed because it didn't fit into an arbitrary time slot. That awful 47 minutes that's the TV hour for many of the cable channels, the 56 minutes, the hour and a quarter. It's terrible, ridiculous stuff, but that's the way that if you want to get it on, you have to follow those rules. But an example, a few years ago, probably the most important film I was ever connected with is something called The Uprising of '34. It was a film about a failed textile strike in the South that we used as a way of presenting the dilemma of the South in terms of labor organization and why it was that that the mindset seemed to be against permitting it. Well, in the process, we had to keep it. We finally persuaded PBS to let us do an hour and a half, or a little less than an hour and a half. But the stuff we left out, we've got interviews with 6 women, all when we were talking to them over the age of 80, who started working in cotton mills at the age of 8 or 10. None of that got into the film, but just think what a wonderful view this would be of that part of our history. For example, we just stumbled on this woman. We were following the fate of one of the old textile organizers and went to see his daughter. He was going to tell us something. She didn't have much to say, but she said, by the way, you should talk with my mother. She worked in the mills when she was a child. Oh, where was she? Well, she was in the other room. wheeled this little lady in with a wheelchair, and she started telling us about sewing an apron before she worked in the mill, spending most of her 8th year sewing this apron and putting a little signal on it and so forth for her bobbin before she went into the mill. And she was just full of enthusiasm for how proud she was of what she did. And then she broke into tears. Well, Judith Helfand, who was my companion on the film, said it must have been rough. She says, well, it was, but that's not what I'm crying. I'm crying because I suddenly am seeing the face of my father, how ashamed he was to have to let work in the mill. Wow. And that's just all in the labor archives in the South now. And someday when we get the money for it, we'll make a DVD, and that will be a part of the history.
You're watching Live and Local. My name's Adam Burke. I was able to sit down with George Stoney when he was in town for the 2004 Iowa City International Documentary Film Festival, where he served as a judge for the festival. George is a social activist, video pioneer, filmmaker, documentarian. He's 88 years old and still going strong. He still makes videos and documentaries. When he was in town for the festival, he showed a few of his new works, showed a couple of his old works, and talked a little bit about that. He's been called the Johnny Appleseed of documentary filmmaking. He's been called the grandfather of public access for his role in basically helping create public access. He was just a great guy to hang out with and sit down with. He's truly one of my personal heroes. And let's get back to George Stoney.
In 1970, I'd been making films for all kinds of people who really should have been making the films themselves, but at that time everything was so cumbersome and difficult that you couldn't expect a doctor to make the tape, or the nurse, or the teacher, or so forth. And so we were doing it. But I realized that they should be doing it. And then I went to Canada for a couple of years with the National Film Board, and we started using video. And I realized that people could do it for themselves. But where are they going to show it? So when I came back to New York, to NYU, we were just getting the cable channels in at the time. And somehow we convinced the city to ask for something we call public access, one channel. And so that's how I got involved. And Red Burns and I started something called the Alternate Media Center at NYU to promote the idea. But we found that New York was not a very good place to begin because so few people had access. Because for the most part, you didn't need cable for better reception. So we went around the country and found a number of places where you needed cable very badly for reception, so they had larger audiences, and helped those people to begin to develop public access. And the concept really came out of the experience we had then. It's funny, a local citizen of Iowa City helped a great deal in that, Nicholas Johnson. Right. Nicholas Johnson was on the FCC. He was one of the big supporters for Johnson, and so Johnson gave him this job. And unlike everybody else in the FCC who were beholden to the industry, he wasn't beholden to the industry. And the FCC had a rule that to put anything on the air, it had to be at least 525 lines of definition. Okay. And our little reel-to-reels then only had about 250 to 300 lines. But we said, look, we're cable casting. It doesn't have to go out on the air. So we took these little devices down to the FCC to show. And of course, Johnson was the only one who had listened to us. But we've got wonderful tape of this. He grabbed it. He says, groovy, man, look what I can do. Just having a great time with this. And then he decided that he could persuade the other people who at that time wanted to penalize cable to have some kind of requirement for public access. So it was thanks to Nicholas Johnson. Nick, if you're listening, I'd be very pleased to say this once again. We wouldn't have had access except for his persuading his fellow board members, but the FCC. And so it was very loosely drawn up. There were all kinds of exceptions, and all the functioning cable systems were grandfathered and so forth, so that the cable operators could really get out of it if they wanted to. But we said, look, we used it to say, look, it's coming, it's coming. You better get used to it and let us get in there and show you how to do it. And that worked for quite a while. We were getting a number of places around the country. But then Midwest Video, the meanies, they took us to court. And in 1979, the Supreme Court said, nuh-uh. The FCC had no right to require this of cable operators. But they had allowed us to put on a demonstration of the good stuff that we were doing around the country. And they said, well, it would be a good thing and would be legal if it's written into each individual franchise. So access, the nature of access and the existence of access depends on the nature and existence of each individual local franchise. I haven't shot film since about the late 80s because, truth to tell, you can it's all going to be seen on the small screen anyway. And the cameras are so much more forgiving. The cost is so much less. And the facility is so much less. So I haven't shot film for a very long time. Though I love some of the things it can do if you're going to be putting it up on a big screen. But by the way, that is getting less and less true. With the high def, it's just amazing what you can put on the screen. And with DVDs as well. When access came in, the idea was that this was something that belonged to the people, the spectrum, PBS, the commercial channels. Some part of that should go to the public. And then we wanted to help the public to use it. And so we saw that as a wonderful way to get our tapes seen by other people. You know, we used to cart around heavy 16mm projectors and set up a screen and all this kind of thing. And then we thought, we'd do it with access. What we didn't know, but we learned very quickly, was that there's a downside to that. When people see your work separately in their individual homes and they're not communicating afterwards, very often it just dies right there. Give me 10 people who come into my living room and I show them a tape and they want to talk afterwards about what they've seen. And I'll sacrifice that from 1,000 people in an auditorium who see it, applaud, and leave. And I'm a social activist. I think that's what they're calling us now. I want to see my work produce results. And I know that just putting it on tape is only the beginning of the problem. Getting it on television is another thing, but eventually action comes from people taking the problem to heart and doing something about it. I'm not saying that the film and video can't have an effect, but change doesn't come just by doing that. Getting the public's attention can be so costly that you're bound to have people who see it as an alternative to what they are accustomed to paying for or should be paying for. And we have to be very careful that people who can make it look good and look professional, but are using it for those purposes, don't shove out of the way the amateurs, the community people who desperately want to speak but are a bit clumsy about using it. I think people are getting much more literate about using cable access. It's interesting that I'm just comparing the classes I have at NYU now in film production with a few years ago. A few years ago, we were teaching people how to do film, and we're talking about emulsions and all this kind of thing. Now, most of that is really not necessary. And my new workshop, which is one of the best I've ever had, it's 15 people. Only one of them is a film student. They come from public history, they come from anthropology, they come from black studies, and they're
using digital.
What?
They're using DVD.
And they're all going to be using this when they leave NYU for their own purposes. I have so many more of my recent ex-students who are actually using the skills that we trained them than 20 years ago. I look back and look at my row book 20 years ago, maybe say after 20 people in the class, 15 people when they left tried to make a living in the business. 5 years later, only 5 of them were making a living out of it. The other people had to find another job. Now they're making their money in other ways, using their skills, using the access, video, and access when they need to do that. And by the way, access is becoming a very good experience for people before they come to college. I guess maybe 2/3 of my students come in with having had some kind of experience with public access in high school. Of course, access in many places is filling in the gaps where the schools don't want to provide the equipment or looking down their noses at practical experience and teaching them all kinds of theory. Well, it's fascinating to look at my workshop this spring. They were all as people from other disciplines, and many of them have had communication theory, including ethics and all those kind of things. They're finding out when they go out and have to do something, ethics becomes a real situation. It's not so simple as they thought. Yeah. What do you do when somebody tells somebody about some other neighborhood to think, how do you use it? What do you do? He said it, right. But is it ethical? How did you get him to do it? All these kind of things.
You have to get a response from
they're facing the reality of ethics right there. Yeah. So I've often said I don't want to teach ethics separate from experience, because it's not real. Access goes up and down, and I've followed it now for 30 years in different places. And I've seen it in Austin, Texas, where for 6 or 8 years they had wonderful, wonderful stuff, and they got absolutely no money at all. It was all volunteer. Then they got a sweetheart deal with the new franchise, and 3 years later they had a staff, and they were down to about 25 or 30 local producers. Their stuff looked much better on the screen, but they'd lost the support of the community. And that mattered when the next franchise came up and there was a fight over it, and they didn't have the support. I think that we have to be very careful that we constantly get, one of the jobs of people like you, one of the access coordinators, is to see that people constantly use it and speak for themselves. It's not good enough just to say, okay, it's here, come. It's like having a public park and saying it's here, but not adding the extra things that make it work, like cleaning it up and having parking and having it safe and so forth and so on. And as you know, in many public spaces, having activities there help to stimulate it. Yeah. So just because it's a good thing doesn't mean it's going to be used well.
Hi, you've been watching Live and Local, a community issues show. If you'd like to know more about Live and Local or PATV, you can visit our website, www.patv.tv, or give us a call, 338-7035. We'd like to hear from you about the show, and maybe you could suggest a new show for us. We welcome your ideas for topics for future shows, so give us a call or email us, and we'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching.